How long should your drawings be? Should they be 60 seconds long or 60 hours long or something in the middle? I see so much confusion about this. Some people are rushing through drawings and therefore not learning much with each drawing because they've just rushed it so much. Then I see people really obsessing and laboring over every single thing that they make. And so instead of doing like 20 sketches, they've just done one picture and overworked it. And so the practice is not efficient. So we're going to figure this whole thing out and give you clarity with it today. All right, so I'm going to give you some arguments for having time limits, arguments for not having time limits, then we'll talk about when to use them, how long to set the time limit, and then when not to use them at all and use something else instead. Here are some arguments for having time limits. The first is that if you imagine a sort of finished, more detailed rendered drawing or painting, most of the fundamental skills of art happen in the first 10 to 20% of making that, in the first 10 to 20% of that process, right? The final 80% is adding little details, fixing things, making little nuanced additions. The first 20%, you are figuring out the overall composition. You're figuring out the proportions of stuff. You're creating the major big forms. You're laying down the big shapes of light and the big shapes of dark. So most of the skill happens in the first 20%. And so if you set a time limit, you can basically do sketches which give you that first 20%, and then you move on to the next one. So in the time it takes to do this kind of finished rendered thing, you could do that first 20% 5 times over. And now you've basically got 5 times as much practice in the same amount of time. And it's really focused you on what really, really matters. Another thing is just, that thing where you are super conservative and tentative, right? And when you're putting down lines, you're like, oh, I'm not sure about this. And then if you're drawing a figure, let's say, it ends up really stiff because you were so hesitant and tentative. If you have a shorter time limit, it means you're like, oh my God, I got no time. I'm just going to go for it. And so shorter time limits were very helpful for me at a certain point because it made me get more gestural and expressive with my marks. And if I didn't have those time limits, I never would have had the guts to just go for it with my marks. It's also super useful for getting into the habit of thinking not everything that I draw and paint needs to be a piece of art. It doesn't need to be a masterpiece. It doesn't need to be finished. I'm just doing it for the process. I'm just doing it for the practice. So you just do this sketchy thing, you get the main ideas out, you learn what you can from it, and then you move on to the next one. It's like, have I learned what I need to learn from this sketch? Good. Is it a beautiful masterpiece? No. But did I learn enough, the main things? Good. On to the next one. It's really good for that mindset. What are the arguments against time limits? Well, for one, sometimes you do need to finish something, right? Like if you only ever practice the first 20%, then you're never going to practice the final 80% and never going to get good at that. So even though a lot of your practice should be on those first 20%, the big compositional things, the big value simplification and stuff like that, at some point you do want to learn. If you want like more refined rendered drawings and paintings, you do have to practice that, right? So you do need sometimes to have more time. A second thing is if you set your time limit too short, in a way that just makes you rush, you're probably not going to learn much, right? Short time limits were only useful to me in figures once I had done lots of longer drawings and gotten more and more confident with what I'm seeing and how to simplify it. Once I'm feeling confident about how to simplify it, then bringing in the short time limit was good because it made me get more decisive and it allowed me to make those more gestural marks. But when I tried to do 1 and 2 minute sketches as a beginner, all it did was it reinforced bad habits that I had because I was just rushing and all I could do was whatever came naturally. And because I hadn't learned anything, what came naturally wasn't the right thing to do. So much better then to use different types of limitations than time limits. So what should you do? If you're a beginner in, let's say, figure drawing or portrait drawing, I wouldn't set a time limit at all. I would give yourself all the time that you need, but I would set other limits. Here's a really nice limitation. For example, you lay out the simple forms of the figure only. That's all you're going to draw, is the simple forms of the figure without anything else. Or you lay out the figure with simple forms and then you put on just two values, light and dark. No nuance, no detail, no shading, fancy stuff. Just here's the light shape and here's the dark shape. And that's it. So now you're limiting yourself on how complex your drawing can be, but not going, and I have to do it in 7 minutes for no reason, right? There's no prizes for speed, but there are prizes, there are rewards for simplification. And so if you can say, I'm going to stop here, all right? In our portrait course, all the way up until week 5, you're only allowed 2 values, and people try and sneak in a 3rd value, get in more little fine details and stuff like that. And I'm like, no, 2 values, right? There should be no, if this is in the dark and this is in the dark, it's just one flat shape across. It's not having any kind of, nothing's happening inside the dark, nothing's happening inside the light, okay? So other limitations are good. If you want to learn gesture drawing and you're just starting out, limit the number of lines and make sure your lines are just C-shaped curves, S-shaped curves, straight lines. So that's one limit. But also be like, I can't use 100 lines. You know, I can use 20 lines or something like that. I can use all the time in the world. I can take as much time as I want, but I'm not allowed to use more than like 20 lines. These are really, really nice limitations. If you are in a more intermediate or advanced stage where you're already a little bit more confident with these simplifications, you could introduce time limits to make you more decisive and help you to just kind of go for it, basically. And so in that case, you want to set that time limit in a way that does make you decisive, right? Because in that case, a lot of people want more time so they can kind of hesitantly and tentatively sketch things out, and then shortening it to a point where it's kind of uncomfortably short pushes you, right? But then the other big thing you got to think is, just because the time is shorter doesn't mean I rush more. If I'm going to shorten the time, it means I'm going to go at a nice, deliberate pace, but I'm going to draw less. I'm going to simplify more. And I know how to simplify more, then I'm ready to put on a time limit. If I've got 30 seconds, I'm going to draw just a few ideas. If I've got a minute, I'll draw a few more ideas. If I've got 2 minutes, I might draw maybe not even more ideas, but just take more time over them. You don't have to draw more, you draw way less, and that's how the time limits work, right? And then one of the big benefits to having that time limit is you're going to make sure you do a big quantity of drawings in the practice time you have. Quantity of drawings is just one of the biggest factors for getting you better. But when you're a beginner and you don't yet know what to practice, I wouldn't worry about that. I would take time to make sure you're getting these skills in place and then ramp up the quantity by shortening the time as you get a bit more confident with those skills. And even then, when you're more intermediate and advanced, I'd recommend mixing in longer drawings, right? Where you go a little bit further. So if you're a beginner, no time limits, but just levels of complexity limits. Like, I'm going to keep it simple. I'm going to simplify. Intermediate or advanced, you're already simplifying, so you put in time limits. And that gives you a good quantity of practice that you're doing. But then I would also mix in longer drawings where you actually do go further. You render them a little bit more. When you get to your longer drawings, you don't have to just add more and more and more. It's not like I've got 4 hours now, so I'm just going to put more information. I'm going to do each toenail and every hair on the leg or whatever, right? Take the extra time to improve your design. Take the extra time, yes, maybe to add a little bit of rendering, make it more refined, but not just more is better. Take just as much time to remove stuff, to simplify stuff away. Oh, I've got all these details. I'm going to take an hour now out of this 4 hours to think about which details I'm going to take out. It's not just more time, put more crap in there. More, sometimes less is more. So where do you want to have more information and where do you want to remove a bunch of information? So here are 3 professional artists talking about how long they draw for.
I think that there's a different kind of value in quick stuff and long stuff.
Okay.
And the value of quick stuff is it builds your confidence and it gets you to commit to decisions.
Yeah.
And the value of long stuff is almost the opposite. It makes you question things. So like when you do a long thing, the thing is even the most simple exercise, so like a 2-value exercise that's completely sharp-edged, could be worked on for 60 hours.
Yeah.
You absolutely could. And like you could make it better every day. People don't realize that, but that like perfectionism has a value to it because it raises your standards.
Yes.
That's what's good about it.
Yeah.
And then on the converse though, it lowers your confidence because you start questioning every decision.
Right.
So I think some balance of doing both. So a lot of classes I start people with 5-minute poses, which are more just about
decisive.
Let's get it down.
Yeah.
And some people are better at that and worse at the long stuff. They can't, emotionally deal with having to change everything.
Yeah.
And some people are the reverse. Some people are really good at like sitting down and really easing into a long pose, but not so great at like dealing with, well, we just got to commit now. Like we got to get on and do something.
And is it more therefore about sketching than about creating finished pieces? What proportion would you recommend people time-wise go for finished artwork versus filling sketchbooks?
That is a very good question. I also kind of think it might be a little bit personal too. Because I guess it depends on your own process. And I can only really say what like I did per se, which was a lot of sketching, a whole lot of sketching for some work. It comes in waves, so it's not like I just have done that forever. But I do still spend academic periods, so to speak, where I will just retake classes, so to speak, or I still do my drawings from life with ink, that kind of thing, because it's a low enough threshold.
You just did a bunch of little studies of Chien Chung Wei, right?
Yeah,
you just showed us.
I still do those.
When you're drawing now, are you still most keen on sort of 20 to 30-minute poses, or do you mix it up more now?
I would say, 20 to 30 minutes feels pretty comfortable to me, because I do enjoy getting a bit more tonality and rendering. I really do enjoy drawing faces on my subjects. Sometimes there's not time, but I do like when I can get a portrait into the figure. And that's just one thing that requires time. You can't rush a face. It doesn't end well.
And
but
how often? Oh no, sorry, go on.
Yeah, but I also don't like really going much over like an hour for a pose, generally speaking, because I find that my drawings will begin to get a bit too stiff, a bit overworked if I work on it that long.
Right. So sort of 20 to 60 minutes.
Yeah.
With 20 to 30 being a bit of a sweet spot, maybe.
Yeah, and so I consider anything from like 20 minutes to an hour to be a long pose, and I know some artists think, that's a very short pose.
Yeah. So different artists with different goals, trying to achieve different results, and so the amount of, the length of their drawings varies. For me personally, I try to do a lot of quicker sketches. Now for figures, for me, that's like 1 minute, 2-minute sketches, but then also 5-minute sketches and 20-minute sketches, and then unrestricted amounts of time. Then for portraits, I don't get much in 1 minute, so it's just not, I would just rush it and it's not that useful. I have done it, but I did that for a short, of YouTube short, so it wasn't super useful. So for me, it's like 5 minutes up to 40 minutes. And if it's a painting, it might be like an hour or an hour and a half. So I've got all different types of ranges, and I know, am I learning something from this or not? My 1 minute, 2 minute figure sketches are giving me a lot of practice, and I'm getting that kind of decisiveness, and I'm pushing myself to simplify. My 4-hour long drawings or whatever, they're pushing me to think about that rendering skill a bit more, and so I'm getting something out of that, but also I'm spending like half of that time thinking about the design. So both have their place for the figures. And then for portraits, which is a little bit newer for me, the super short time limits are not super useful. I may never go down to like these 1 minute drawings for portraits, but 5 minutes I do find useful because I can get the main stuff in and then move on to the next one. And then I can do longer ones for something a bit more refined. So I hope that this helps you figure out what you should be doing with time limits for yourself.
You can learn how to see the simple forms of the rib cage, pelvis, and head in any pose. This 3D model can help you do that with this exercise where you kind of replicate the pose with the model, and then you can sketch the pose in those simple terms. This is incredibly powerful for your figure drawing skills, and this is what we teach in our Figure Foundations course, which I'm going to be taking a group through in November in our study group. So check out the link below if you want to learn how to draw figures. It's the most powerful tool that we have for teaching figure drawing. We also now have a portrait drawing course in the study group, and it's also about simplifying the forms of the head and then simplifying the forms of the face like you see here. And this is something that I teach step by step in our portrait course, which is available in the study group as well. And then in November, we're going to be doing portrait painting. So if you're interested in painting portraits, or if you're interested in your foundational figure drawing skills, come to the study group. The link is below.
Let me know in the comments if you have any more questions about this, because I'd love to hear them. There should be another awesome video up here on the screen, so check it out, and I'll see you over there.